I'm 71 years old now, a retired FBI special agent, living in a modest house outside Duluth, Minnesota. For 46 years, I've kept a secret that the United States government buried so deep that even mentioning it could have ended my career, my freedom, possibly my life. But at my age, with whatever time I have left, I've decided the truth matters more than the consequences. My name is Robert Chandler, and in June of 1978, I was assigned to interrogate something that wasn't human. They called it a debriefing. They called it a consultation. They used every bureaucratic term they could find to avoid saying what it actually was. But I knew, sitting in that briefing room at FBI headquarters in Washington, watching my section chief's hands shake as he slid the classified folder across the table, that whatever waited for me in Nevada would change everything I thought I knew about my job, my country, and our place in the universe. I was 25 years old when I joined the Bureau in 1971, fresh out of Georgetown with a degree in psychology and a naive belief that I could make a difference. By 1978, I'd worked my way up to special agent in the Criminal Investigative Division, specializing in interrogation and behavioral analysis. I questioned mobsters, domestic terrorists, serial offenders. I developed a reputation for staying calm under pressure, for reading people, for knowing when someone was lying and when they were telling a truth they wished they could hide. My personnel file called me methodical, patient, and unusually perceptive. Those were the qualities that got me selected for what my section chief, a man named Gregory Walsh, called the most sensitive assignment of my career. "You're going to Nevada," Walsh said, not meeting my eyes. "There's a facility there conducting research for the Department of Defense. They've requested FBI assistance with a debriefing situation." I waited for more information, but Walsh just stared at the folder he'd given me. Inside were travel orders, security clearances I'd never seen before, and a single photograph. The photograph showed what looked like a medical examination room, sterile and white, with a table in the center. On the table sat something that my brain initially registered as a child or a burn victim. But the proportions were wrong. The limbs too thin, the head too large, the skin texture unlike anything human. "What am I looking at, sir?" I asked, keeping my voice level. Walsh finally met my gaze. "That's classified until you arrive on site. You'll receive a full briefing from the facility director. Your job is to establish communication if possible, assess threat level, and determine intent. Standard interrogation protocols apply, with modifications for the unique nature of the subject." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Agent Chandler, what you're about to see is real. It's not a hoax, not a training exercise, not some Cold War psyop. The people at this facility need someone who can stay objective, who won't panic, who can think clearly in a situation that defies everything we understand about the world. That's why we're sending you." I flew out of Washington the next morning on a military transport, no passenger manifest, no flight plan filed with civilian authorities. We landed at Nellis Air Force Base just after noon, and I was immediately transferred to an unmarked sedan with blacked-out windows. The driver, an Air Force captain who never gave his name, drove north into the desert for what felt like hours. No conversation, no explanation, just the sound of tires on asphalt and the air conditioning struggling against the Nevada heat. We passed through 3 different security checkpoints, each one more isolated than the last. At the final checkpoint, armed guards inspected my credentials for 20 minutes before waving us through a gate that led to nothing but empty desert and distant mountains. The facility itself was almost invisible until we were right on top of it. Low concrete buildings that seemed to grow out of the red earth, designed to be overlooked by satellite surveillance. We parked in an underground garage, and I was escorted through corridors that smelled of disinfectant and recycled air. My escort, a man in civilian clothes who introduced himself only as Dr. Patterson, walked quickly, and spoke in clipped sentences. You'll have access to Subject 1 for 8 hours per day, 6 days per week. All sessions are monitored and recorded. You will not discuss this assignment with anyone outside the facility, including other FBI personnel. You will not remove any materials from the facility. You will submit daily reports directly to me. Do you understand? I nodded, my training keeping my expression neutral, even as my heart rate climbed. Dr. Patterson stopped outside a heavy door, marked only with the number 7. The subject has been in our custody for approximately 6 weeks. It was recovered from a crash site in rural Montana on May 3rd. There were 3 occupants of the craft. 2 died on impact. This one survived with minimal injuries. It has not attempted escape, has not shown aggression, and has complied with basic requests. But it hasn't communicated anything meaningful. That's where you come in. He handed me a thick binder, medical reports, behavioral observations, everything we know so far. Review it tonight. You start tomorrow at 0800 hours. I spent that night in a small room that reminded me of military barracks, reading the file over and over until the words blurred together. The medical reports described physiology that seemed impossible, organs that didn't match any known biological system, a body temperature of 94 degrees Fahrenheit, blood chemistry that contained elements the lab couldn't identify, no digestive system as we understood it, no reproductive organs visible. The being breathed, but analysis of its respiration suggested it was processing oxygen at a fraction of the efficiency of human lungs, leading researchers to theorize it might be adapted for a different atmospheric composition. The behavioral observations were even stranger. The subject sat motionless for hours at a time. It responded to basic gestures, moving when directed, accepting food it never ate. But it showed no emotion, no curiosity, no fear. The research team had tried everything from flashcards to computer interfaces, and the being simply watched them with what the reports called detached observation. I didn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about that photograph, about the thing waiting in room 7, about the fact that everything I'd believed about the universe had just been proven wrong. By the time the sun came up over the Nevada desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, visible through my small window, I'd made a decision. Whatever that being was, whatever it knew, I would treat it the way I treated every subject I'd ever interrogated. With respect, with patience, and with the assumption that communication was possible if I could just find the right approach. I had no idea, sitting there in that sparse military room, that the being in room 7 had been waiting for someone exactly like me. And what it would show me over the next 2 weeks would make me question not just my assignment, but everything humanity had ever assumed about our role in the cosmos. I'm 71 years old now, a retired FBI special agent, living in a modest house outside Duluth, Minnesota. For 46 years, I've kept a secret that the United States government buried so deep that even mentioning it could have ended my career, my freedom, possibly my life. But at my age, with whatever time I have left, I've decided the truth matters more than the consequences. My name is Robert Chandler, and in June of 1978, I was assigned to interrogate something that wasn't human. They called it a debriefing. They called it a consultation. They used every bureaucratic term they could find to avoid saying what it actually was. But I knew, sitting in that briefing room at FBI headquarters in Washington, watching my section chief's hands shake as he slid the classified folder across the table, that whatever waited for me in Nevada would change everything I thought I knew about my job, my country, and our place in the universe. I was 25 years old when I joined the Bureau in 1971, fresh out of Georgetown with a degree in psychology and a naive belief that I could make a difference. By 1978, I'd worked my way up to special agent in the Criminal Investigative Division, specializing in interrogation and behavioral analysis. I'd questioned mobsters, domestic terrorists, serial offenders. I developed a reputation for staying calm under pressure, for reading people, for knowing when someone was lying and when they were telling a truth they wished they could hide. My personnel file called me methodical, patient, and unusually perceptive. Those were the qualities that got me selected for what my section chief, a man named Gregory Walsh, called the most sensitive assignment of my career. "You're going to Nevada," Walsh said, not meeting my eyes. "There's a facility there conducting research for the Department of Defense. They've requested FBI assistance with a debriefing situation." I waited for more information, but Walsh just stared at the folder he'd given me. Inside were travel orders, security clearances I'd never seen before, and a single photograph. The photograph showed what looked like a medical examination room, sterile and white, with a table in the center. On the table sat something that my brain initially registered as a child or a burn victim. But the proportions were wrong. The limbs too thin, the head too large, the skin texture unlike anything human. "What am I looking at, sir?" I asked, keeping my voice level. Walsh finally met my gaze. "That's classified until you arrive on site. You'll receive a full briefing from the facility director. Your job is to establish communication if possible, assess threat level, and determine intent. Standard interrogation protocols apply, with modifications for the unique nature of the subject." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Agent Chandler, what you're about to see is real. It's not a hoax, not a training exercise, not some Cold War psyop. The people at this facility need someone who can stay objective, who won't panic, who can think clearly in a situation that defies everything we understand about the world. That's why we're sending you." I flew out of Washington the next morning on a military transport, no passenger manifest, no flight plan filed with civilian authorities. We landed at Nellis Air Force Base just after noon, and I was immediately transferred to an unmarked sedan with blacked-out windows. The driver, an Air Force captain who never gave his name, drove north into the desert for what felt like hours. No conversation, no explanation, just the sound of tires on asphalt and the air conditioning struggling against the Nevada heat. We passed through 3 different security checkpoints, each one more isolated than the last. At the final checkpoint, armed guards inspected my credentials for 20 minutes before waving us through a gate that led to nothing but empty desert and distant mountains. The facility itself was almost invisible until we were right on top of it. Low concrete buildings that seemed to grow out of the red earth, designed to be overlooked by satellite surveillance. We parked in an underground garage, and I was escorted through corridors that smelled of disinfectant and recycled air. My escort, a man in civilian clothes who introduced himself only as Dr. Patterson, walked quickly and spoke in clipped sentences. "You'll have access to Subject 1 for 8 hours per day, 6 days per week. All sessions are monitored and recorded. You will not discuss this assignment with anyone outside the facility, including other FBI personnel. You will not remove any materials from the facility. You will submit daily reports directly to me. Do you understand?" I nodded, my training keeping my expression neutral, even as my heart rate climbed. Dr. Patterson stopped outside a heavy door, marked only with the number 7. The subject has been in our custody for approximately 6 weeks. It was recovered from a crash site in rural Montana on May 3rd. There were 3 occupants of the craft. 2 died on impact. This one survived with minimal injuries. It has not attempted escape, has not shown aggression, and has complied with basic requests. But it hasn't communicated anything meaningful. That's where you come in. He handed me a thick binder, medical reports, behavioral observations, everything we know so far. Review it tonight. You start tomorrow at 0800 hours. I spent that night in a small room that reminded me of military barracks. reading the file over and over until the words blurred together. The medical reports described physiology that seemed impossible, organs that didn't match any known biological system, a body temperature of 94 degrees Fahrenheit, blood chemistry that contained elements the lab couldn't identify, no digestive system as we understood it, no reproductive organs visible. The being breathed, but analysis of its respiration suggested it was processing oxygen at a fraction of the efficiency of human lungs, leading researchers to theorize it might be adapted for a different atmospheric composition. The behavioral observations were even stranger. The subject sat motionless for hours at a time. It responded to basic gestures, moving when directed, accepting food it never ate. But it showed no emotion, no curiosity, no fear. The research team had tried everything from flashcards to computer interfaces, and the being simply watched them with what the reports called detached observation. I didn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about that photograph, about the thing waiting in room 7, about the fact that everything I'd believed about the universe had just been proven wrong. By the time the sun came up over the Nevada desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, visible through my small window, I'd made a decision. Whatever that being was, whatever it knew, I would treat it the way I treated every subject I'd ever interrogated. With respect, with patience, and with the assumption that communication was possible if I could just find the right approach. I had no idea, sitting there in that sparse military room, that the being in room 7 had been waiting for someone exactly like me. And what it would show me over the next 2 weeks would make me question not just my assignment, but everything humanity had ever assumed about our role in the cosmos. The facility operated on a schedule that felt deliberately designed to disorient. No windows in the corridors, no natural light, just the constant hum of ventilation systems and fluorescent bulbs that made it impossible to track time. I reported to room 7 at exactly 0800 hours, accompanied by Dr. Patterson and 2 armed guards who took positions outside the door. The room was divided by a wall of reinforced glass, 10 inches thick according to the specifications in my briefing materials. On my side was a metal desk, a chair, a microphone connected to speakers in the observation chamber, and a 2-way radio for communicating with the monitoring team. On the other side of the glass was a space about 12 feet square, containing a metal bench, a dim overhead light, and the being. My first direct look at it, not filtered through a photograph or clinical report, hit me harder than I'd expected. It sat on the bench with perfect stillness, hands folded in what almost looked like a meditation posture. The skin was gray, not the gray of ash or concrete, but something that seemed to absorb light, making it difficult to focus on clearly. The head was disproportionately large, dominating a frame that looked fragile, almost delicate. No hair, no ears that I could see, just smooth contours that suggested a skull structure completely unlike human anatomy. The eyes were the worst part, entirely black, no visible iris or pupil, just dark pools that seemed to go on forever. When those eyes fixed on me as I entered the room, I felt something I'd never experienced in 15 years of interrogations. Not fear exactly, but a profound sense of being completely transparent, as if every thought in my head was visible to whatever intelligence looked out from behind that alien gaze. I sat down at the desk, took a breath to steady myself, and picked up the microphone. The speakers would allow the being to hear me clearly, though whether it could understand English remained an opened question. "Good morning," I said, keeping my tone neutral and professional. "My name is Robert Chandler. I'm here to talk with you, to understand your situation, and to see if we can establish communication." The being didn't move. No acknowledgement, no reaction, just that steady, unblinking stare. I'd expected this based on the reports, but experiencing it directly was different. In every interrogation I'd ever conducted, there was some micro-expression, some tell, some tiny indication of what the subject was thinking. This being gave me nothing. I spent the first hour trying standard approaches. Simple questions about origin, purpose, the crash that had brought it here. I showed pictures, pointed at objects, attempted to establish even the most basic yes-no communication system. The being watched, motionless, as if I were a television program it had no particular interest in. The monitoring team, watching through cameras mounted in the corners, remained silent. Dr. Patterson had instructed me to proceed at my own pace, using whatever methods I thought appropriate. By hour 3, I'd abandoned formal interrogation techniques and was simply talking, narrating what I was doing, describing the facility, explaining my role. Still nothing. The being sat there, patient and unknowable, while I exhausted every approach I'd ever learned. At noon, Dr. Patterson's voice crackled through my radio. "Agent Chandler, take your lunch break. Resume at 1300 hours." I left the room feeling frustrated and slightly foolish, as if I'd spent the morning talking to a statue. The cafeteria was small, serving maybe 24 people who all had security clearances I couldn't begin to guess at. I ate alone, reviewing my notes, trying to figure out what I was missing. A woman in a white lab coat sat down across from me without asking. Dr. Sarah Chen, according to her badge, chief biologist for the facility. "You're the interrogator," she said, not quite a question. "I am." "Good luck. We've had linguists, psychologists, even brought in a guy who claimed he could communicate telepathically. Nothing works. It just sits there." She paused, stirring her coffee. "Between you and me, I don't think it wants to communicate. I think it's waiting for something." I returned to room 7 with a different strategy. Instead of treating this like an interrogation, I would treat it like an observation. I sat down, turned off the microphone, and simply watched the being the way it had been watching me. Minutes stretched into an hour. The being didn't move, didn't shift position, didn't show any sign of discomfort or fatigue. Its breathing was barely perceptible, just the slightest rise and fall of its narrow chest. I noticed details I'd missed before. The fingers were longer than human fingers, with an extra joint. The feet, visible beneath the simple gray garment it wore, had a structure that suggested it might walk differently than we did, with weight distributed across a broader surface. The skin texture, when I looked closely, seemed to have an almost iridescent quality, like oil on water, though so subtle I couldn't be sure if I was really seeing it, or if my eyes were playing tricks in the dim light. At some point during that second hour of silence, something changed. The being's head tilted, just a fraction of an inch, and I felt rather than saw a shift in its attention. It was no longer passively observing me. It was actively studying me, and the intensity of that focus was almost physical. I leaned forward slightly, maintaining eye contact, and for the first time I spoke without the microphone. Just a quiet statement meant only for the being and myself. "You understand me, don't you? You've understood every word we've said since you got here." The being's hand moved, slowly, deliberately, and pressed against the glass. The gesture was so human, so familiar, that it startled me. I stood up and walked to the glass, stopping about a foot away from where its hand rested. Up close, I could see the skin wasn't entirely smooth. There were fine lines, almost like fingerprints, but in patterns that spiraled in ways that made my eyes hurt if I looked too long. I raised my own hand and placed it against the glass, mirroring its position. Our hands were separated by 10 inches of reinforced barrier, human and alien. And in that moment, I felt something that made every rational part of my mind reject what was happening. a sensation of pressure inside my skull, not painful but intensely present, like the feeling of a thought forming that wasn't my own. An image flashed across my consciousness. Not a memory, not a dream, but something else entirely. I saw the facility from above, as if through the being's perspective before the crash. I saw the desert, the mountains, the invisible buildings hiding in plain sight. And I saw myself, walking into room 7 that morning, as clearly as if I were watching security footage. The image lasted maybe 3 seconds, and then it was gone, leaving me standing there with my hand against the glass and the absolute certainty that the being had just communicated with me in a way that had nothing to do with language. I stepped back slowly, my heart pounding. The being lowered its hand and returned to its previous position on the bench. When I looked up at the camera in the corner, I saw the red recording light blinking steadily. Everything that had just happened was documented. I picked up the radio with shaking hands. "Dr. Patterson, I need to speak with you immediately." His response came within seconds. "What happened?" The biometric monitors showed unusual readings. I chose my words carefully, aware that everything I said was being recorded. "I believe the subject is capable of communication, but not through conventional means. I need authorization to proceed with alternative protocols." There was a long pause. Then Patterson's voice came back, tight with controlled excitement. "Continue your session, Agent Chandler. Document everything. We'll debrief at 1600 hours." The remaining hour of that first day set the pattern for what would follow. I would sit, sometimes speaking, sometimes silent, and the being would watch. Occasionally, maybe once every hour or two, it would make a gesture, a tilt of the head, a positioning of hands. And sometimes, not every time, I would feel that pressure in my skull and see images I couldn't explain. A star field, unlike any constellation I recognized. Machinery that looked organic and technological at the same time. And once, disturbingly, what looked like Earth from space, with lines of light connecting certain points across the surface in a web pattern that seemed both random and deliberately structured. I documented everything in my reports, describing the images as accurately as I could, knowing how insane it must sound to anyone reading them. By the end of the first week, I developed something like a rhythm with the being. I would arrive at 0800, spend the first hour simply establishing presence, then move closer to the glass, and wait. The being seemed to respond to proximity, to the narrowing of physical distance even though we couldn't actually touch. The images became clearer, more frequent, and I started to recognize patterns. Certain gestures preceded certain types of images. A hand raised with palm outward seemed to indicate location or place. Fingers touching the being's own chest appeared to reference itself or its kind. I was learning a language, but one that bypassed every normal channel of human communication. Dr. Patterson and his team watched it all, analyzing the recordings, trying to understand the mechanism. Dr. Chen proposed it might be some form of electromagnetic signaling that our brains could interpret as imagery. Others suggested quantum entanglement or dimensions of physics we hadn't discovered. But no one could explain why it only worked with me, why the being had chosen this particular method of contact, or what it was trying to tell me with these fragmented visions. On the 8th day, I walked into room 7 and immediately knew something was different. The being stood near the glass, waiting, and when I approached it, placed both hands against the barrier. I mirrored the gesture, and the sensation that followed was stronger than anything I'd experienced before. Not just an image, but a sequence, almost like watching a film. I saw the crash, the facility, the guards, the examinations. I saw myself from the being's perspective, arriving that first day, sitting at the desk, trying uselessly to communicate through words. And then I saw something that made my breath catch. I saw the being's two companions, the ones who had died in the crash, and I felt a wave of something that could only be called grief. Not alien grief, not some incomprehensible emotion from an unknowable mind. Just grief, pure and simple and heartbreakingly familiar. The being was alone, stranded on a world not its own, surrounded by creatures it couldn't speak to in any way we recognized, and it had lost the only others of its kind within millions of miles. Whatever it was, whatever purpose had brought it to Earth, it was suffering in a way I understood completely. The being's grief changed everything about how I approached my sessions in Room 7. I stopped thinking of it as a subject or a specimen, and started thinking of it as a person, however alien its form. On the 9th day, I brought something that wasn't in any protocol. A photograph of my wife, Karen, taken the previous summer at a lake in Virginia. I held it up to the glass and spoke without the microphone. This is my wife. She's the most important person in my life. I haven't seen her in 9 days because of this assignment, and I miss her. The being moved closer to the glass, studying the photograph with what seemed like genuine interest. Then it did something unexpected. It raised one hand and touched 2 fingers to its chest, then extended the same hand toward me, palm up, in what looked unmistakably like a gesture of acknowledgement or understanding. Over the next several days, I developed a routine that the monitoring team found highly irregular, but couldn't argue with. Given the results, I would spend the first hour of each session sharing something personal. Stories about my childhood in Ohio, my time at Georgetown, cases I'd worked on. The being never responded verbally, but the attention it gave was complete and focused. And in return, when I placed my hands against the glass, the images became more structured, more deliberate, as if the being was learning how to shape them into something I could better understand. I saw landscapes that had to be from another world, structures that defied physics as I understood it, and beings similar to my subject moving through spaces that seemed designed for their specific physiology. The being was showing me its life, or a version of it, in the only way it could. Dr. Patterson grew increasingly nervous about my methods. "You're supposed to be interrogating it, not befriending it," he said during one of our daily debriefs. "With respect, sir, traditional interrogation has yielded nothing. This approach is producing actual communication." I showed him my latest report, filled with sketches of what I'd seen, descriptions of the images, attempts to catalog and categorize the information. The subject is telling us about its origin, its technology, possibly its culture. Isn't that exactly what you wanted? Patterson studied the sketches, his expression unreadable. "What it's telling you, Agent Chandler, is what it wants you to know. Don't forget that. This thing crashed here, but we have no idea if that was an accident or something else. Its companions died, but we don't know if it's grieving or if it caused their deaths. You're getting information, but you're also being manipulated." The warning stayed with me, adding a layer of caution to my sessions. But by the end of the second week, I'd established something unprecedented. The being and I had developed a functional communication system. It would show me images, and I would respond with words or gestures that indicated understanding or confusion. When I was confused, it would repeat the image with variations, adding context until I grasped what it was trying to convey. The process was slow and exhausting, requiring intense concentration that left me drained after each session. But it worked. I learned that the being came from somewhere it conceptualized as far, not in distance, but in some other metric I couldn't quite grasp. I learned that it traveled in what looked like organic ships, structures that seemed to be grown rather than built. And I learned that this wasn't its first time observing Earth. On day 13, the being showed me something that made me stop the session and request an immediate meeting with Dr. Patterson and the facility director, a stern Air Force colonel named Marcus Webb, who I'd barely seen since my arrival. We met in a secure conference room, and I described what I'd seen as precisely as possible. The subject showed me Earth from space, but not current Earth, historical Earth. I saw what looked like ancient civilizations, Egyptian pyramids under construction, maybe Aztec temples, I'm not certain. And in each image, there were beings like my subject, observing from a distance. It's telling me they've been watching us for thousands of years. Colonel Webb leaned back in his chair. You're saying this thing claims its species has been monitoring human development since ancient times. I'm saying it showed me images that suggest that, yes, sir. The implications were staggering, and the debate that followed lasted 3 hours. If the being's species had been observing Earth for millennia, what did that mean for human history? For our development? For everything we thought we'd achieved on our own? Dr. Chen raised the possibility that the images weren't memories, but fabrications designed to intimidate or impress us. But I couldn't shake the feeling that what the being had shown me was true, or at least true from its perspective. The level of detail, the consistency across multiple images, the way certain structures appeared in different stages of construction across different viewing sessions. It felt like documentation, not invention. Colonel Webb made a decision that changed the nature of my assignment. Agent Chandler, your new priority is determining why they've been watching us and what they want. If this species has the capability to observe us for thousands of years without us knowing, they're either completely benign or waiting for something. I need to know which. The next session, I approached the being with new questions, but also with something close to fear. If its kind had been watching humanity for thousands of years, then it knew us in ways we could never know it. Our history, our patterns, our vulnerabilities. Everything was visible to observers we'd never detected. I stood at the glass and spoke clearly. Why have you been watching us? What are you waiting for? The being tilted its head in that gesture I'd come to recognize as consideration. Then it placed both hands on the glass, and the sensation that followed was stronger than ever before. I saw Earth again, but this time I saw it change. I saw human populations grow, spread, build. I saw cities rise, technology develop, lights spreading across the continents. But I also saw something else, something that looked like measurements or valuations, as if each stage of human development was being cataloged and assessed against some unknown criteria. The image shifted, and I saw something that made my blood run cold. I saw Earth surrounded by what looked like a grid or network, invisible lines connecting points across the planet in patterns I'd glimpsed before. But now, I understood what I was seeing. It wasn't random. It was a monitoring system, a surveillance network that had been tracking human activity for longer than recorded history. And we were approaching something, some threshold marked in the images, by a change in color or intensity that I couldn't quite interpret, but that clearly signified importance. The being was showing me that humanity was being measured against something, and we were getting close to a boundary we didn't know existed. When the images faded and I stepped back from the glass, my hands were shaking. The being sat down on its bench, its dark eyes still fixed on me, and I had the terrible certainty that I'd just been given a warning. I submitted my report on the monitoring system at 1800 hours that evening, and by 0600 the next morning I was summoned to Colonel Webb's office. The room was packed with people I'd never seen before, military personnel with ranks I didn't recognize, civilians in suits who didn't introduce themselves, and Dr. Patterson looking like he'd aged 10 years overnight. Webb gestured to an empty chair. Agent Chandler, your report has been forwarded to Washington. We've been instructed to proceed with what they're calling enhanced interrogation protocols. You're going to ask the subject specific questions, and you're going to get specific answers. No more stories about ancient pyramids. We need tactical information. The list of questions they gave me was extensive and pointed. What was the monitoring system's purpose? How many of the being's species were currently observing Earth? What would happen if humanity crossed the threshold shown in the images? Did the being species have hostile intent? Were there other species involved in monitoring Earth? The questions went on for 3 pages, single-spaced, covering every conceivable aspect of potential threat assessment. I read through them twice while Colonel Webb watched. Sir, with respect, I'm not sure the subject can answer these questions in the format you're requesting. Our communication is limited to images and impressions. Getting this level of specific detail might not be possible. Webb's expression hardened. Then make it possible, Agent Chandler. You've established more communication with that thing than anyone thought feasible. Now we need you to push further. I spent that night reviewing everything I'd learned about the being's communication method, trying to figure out how to translate abstract policy questions into something it could respond to through imagery. The problem was fundamental. The being seemed to think in concepts and relationships rather than linear cause and effect when it showed me the monitoring system. It wasn't making a claim about political structure or military intention. It was showing me a pattern, a reality it perceived, and expecting me to derive meaning from the pattern itself. Asking, "What is your species' intent?" was like asking someone to describe the color blue to a person who'd never had sight. The framework was incompatible, but I had my orders, and the next morning I returned to room 7 with the list of questions and a growing sense that I was about to damage the fragile communication we'd built. The being was standing when I entered, positioned near the glass as if it had been waiting. I sat down at my desk and picked up the microphone, then immediately put it down again. The formal approach felt wrong. Instead, I walked to the glass and spoke directly. They want answers. Specific answers about your species, your purpose here, your intentions toward humanity. I need to ask you questions that might not make sense in the way we've been communicating, but I'm going to try. The being moved closer until only the glass separated us by inches. I could see my own reflection in its dark eyes, distorted and small. I started with the simplest question on the list. How many of your kind are currently observing Earth? I placed my hand on the glass and waited. The image that came was unlike anything I'd seen before. Not a place or an event, but a concept. I saw points of light scattered across what might have been a representation of near-Earth space, maybe hundreds of them, maybe thousands. But the lights weren't static. They moved, shifted, appeared, and disappeared in patterns that suggested they weren't physical objects, but something else. Monitoring stations, remote sensors, beings like my subject using technology I couldn't comprehend. The image refused to resolve into a clear answer, and when it faded, I was left with an impression of vast scale and distributed presence, but no concrete number. I tried the next question. What is the purpose of the monitoring system? Another image, this one clearer. I saw Earth again, but also other planets, other worlds, each surrounded by similar networks of observation. Not just Earth, then. This was something they did everywhere, a standard protocol applied across multiple civilizations or species. But why? I pushed deeper, trying to shape my thoughts into a question the being could grasp. The response came in fragments. I saw civilizations rise and fall, technological development accelerating, reaching critical points marked by the same color shift I'd seen before. And in some cases, I saw intervention. Not invasion, not destruction, but something more subtle. A dampening, a containment, as if the monitoring species had the capability to limit or control the development of the civilizations they watched. The implications were staggering and terrifying. We weren't just being observed, we were being managed. And if we crossed some invisible line, actions would be taken. I stepped back from the glass, my heart racing. You're showing me that you can stop us. That if humanity develops too far, too fast, your kind has the ability to intervene and prevent it. The being didn't confirm or deny, just held my gaze with those impossibly deep eyes. I tried a different approach. What defines the threshold? What would make humanity cross the line? The images came faster now, almost overwhelming. I saw nuclear weapons, space exploration, artificial intelligence, genetic engineering. I saw technological achievements that humanity had already accomplished, and some we were still working toward. But the pattern wasn't about any single technology. It was about rate, about speed, about the acceleration itself. The being species wasn't afraid of what we might build. They were afraid of how fast we were building it, how quickly we were moving from one breakthrough to the next, without pause or reflection. Humanity was developing faster than any other species they'd encountered, and that unpredictability made us dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with weapons or hostile intent. I reported this to Colonel Webb and his assembled team, trying to convey the nuance of what I'd learned. Dr. Chen immediately saw the logical problem. If they're concerned about our rate of development, then the more we learn from them, the faster we'll develop. This interrogation is accelerating the very thing they're worried about. The room went quiet as everyone processed the implications. One of the civilians, a man who'd been introduced only as being from the Department of Defense, spoke up. Then we need to determine their containment capability. If they can stop human development, we need to know how, and we need to develop countermeasures. I felt a wave of frustration. Sir, I don't think you understand what I'm telling you. This isn't a military threat we can defend against. This is a species that's been monitoring Earth for thousands of years, that has a technology so far beyond ours that we can barely comprehend their communication method, let alone their defensive capabilities. Colonel Webb cut off the brewing argument. Agent Chandler, tomorrow you're going to ask the subject one question, and you're going to get a clear answer. Can they stop human technological development? And if so, how? The meeting adjourned, and I walked back to my quarters feeling like I was being asked to negotiate with the ocean or interrogate the weather. The being species operated on scales and timelines that made human concerns about defense and sovereignty almost quaint. But I had my orders, and the next morning I returned to room 7, prepared to push the communication further than I'd ever dared before. The being was waiting, and when I placed my hands on the glass and formed the question in my mind as clearly as I could, the response was immediate and overwhelming. I saw Earth from space, our satellites, our space stations, our fledgling presence beyond the atmosphere. And I saw them all go dark simultaneously, not destroyed but deactivated, as if someone had flipped a switch and turned off every electronic system humanity had placed in orbit. Then I saw power grids fail, communications networks collapse, data centers go silent. Not through physical attack, but through some form of targeted electromagnetic disruption that left the infrastructure intact but completely non-functional. The being species could, if they chose, roll back human civilization to pre-industrial levels without firing a shot, without causing a single casualty, simply by disrupting the technological systems we'd become dependent on. And they could do it in a way that would look like natural phenomena, solar flares or magnetic anomalies, nothing that would definitively prove outside intervention. The image faded, and I stood there, processing what I'd just been shown. The being had answered the question with perfect clarity. Yes, they could stop us. And their method wouldn't require the invasions or warfare that filled our science fiction. They would simply make our technology stop working, and humanity would be forced to rebuild from whatever level they permitted. I turned away from the glass and spoke into the microphone, knowing the monitoring team was recording every word. Subject has demonstrated capability for large-scale technological disruption. Assessment: defensive countermeasures would be ineffective. Recommendation: Further interrogation should focus on determining what actions would trigger intervention, with goal of avoiding threshold crossing. Colonel Webb's voice came through my radio within minutes. Negative, Agent Chandler. Your new orders are to determine the mechanism of their disruption capability. We need technical details. I spent the rest of that session trying to comply, but the being either couldn't or wouldn't show me the technical details of how its species accomplished electromagnetic disruption on a planetary scale. Instead, it showed me more examples. Other civilizations, other worlds, some recovering after intervention, others apparently permanently locked at certain developmental levels. The message was clear. This wasn't theoretical, wasn't a bluff or intimidation tactic. The being species had done this before, multiple times, across multiple worlds. They had a protocol for managing developing species, and humanity was approaching the point where that protocol would be activated. As I left Room 7 that evening, I had a thought that chilled me more than anything else I'd learned. The being had been cooperating with me, answering questions, sharing information in ways that seemed designed to warn rather than threaten. What if the crash hadn't been an accident? What if the being had come here specifically to communicate this warning, and we were too focused on interrogation and defense to understand that we were being offered a chance to change course? On day 16 of my assignment, I made a decision that violated every protocol I'd been given. I walked into Room 7 without my notes, without the list of questions from Colonel Webb, without any intention of conducting a formal interrogation. I sat down at my desk and simply looked at the being for a long moment, then spoke without the microphone. I don't think you crashed here by accident. I think you came to warn us, and we've been too busy treating you like an enemy to understand that. So I'm going to stop asking questions for them and start listening for myself. Show me what you think I need to know. The being's response was immediate. It stood, moved to the glass, and placed both hands against the barrier. When I mirrored the gesture, the sensation was different from every previous contact. Not images alone, but something deeper, as if the being was sharing not just what it had seen, but what it understood. I saw humanity from an outside perspective, and the view was both humbling and terrifying. We weren't the first technological species the being's kind had encountered. Weren't even close to the most advanced. But we were different in one crucial way. Every other species they'd observed had developed along relatively predictable timelines, with technological advancement following natural patterns of discovery and implementation. Humanity's development was erratic, marked by sudden leaps that seemed to come from nowhere. The agricultural revolution, the scientific method, the industrial revolution, nuclear physics, computers, genetic engineering. Each breakthrough came faster than the last, with less time between paradigm shifts. From the being's perspective, humanity was like a child learning to run before it had mastered walking, gaining capabilities without the wisdom or caution that usually accompanied such power. The images shifted, and I saw specific moments in human history through the being's eyes. The Trinity test in 1945, the first nuclear detonation, and I felt the alarm it had triggered across the monitoring network. Not because nuclear weapons themselves were unprecedented. Other species had developed similar technology, but because of how quickly humanity had moved from discovering radioactivity to weaponizing it. Less than 50 years from Becquerel's initial observations to the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The being showed me other species that had taken thousands of years to reach similar capability, with social and ethical frameworks evolving alongside technological power. Humanity had compressed that timeline to the point where our technological capability was drastically outpacing our collective wisdom about how to use it. I saw the space race, the Apollo missions, and again, that sense of alarm from the monitoring network. Not at the achievement itself, but at the acceleration. From the Wright brothers' first flight in 1903 to landing on the moon in 1969, 66 years, the being showed me species that had taken tens of thousands of years to move from atmospheric flight to leaving their home worlds. Humanity was developing at a rate that suggested either external intervention, something giving us knowledge we shouldn't have yet, or some unique quality in human cognition that allowed for rapid conceptual leaps. The being species hadn't determined which, and that uncertainty made humanity unpredictable in ways they found deeply concerning. The images became more recent, more personal. I saw computer networks spreading across Earth, information technology developing at exponential rates. I saw genetic research, artificial intelligence programs, quantum computing experiments. Each represented another leap, another acceleration, another indication that humanity wasn't following the normal pattern. And woven through all these images was that threshold marker, that line we were approaching, getting clearer now. It wasn't a specific technology or achievement. It was a saturation point, a moment when our technological capability would exceed our ability to control it, when the systems we'd created would become complex enough to generate emergent behaviors we couldn't predict or prevent. The being species had seen this before, on other worlds, and it never ended well without intervention. But there was something else in the images, something the being seemed to be struggling to convey. I saw moments of human creativity, art, music, literature. I saw acts of compassion, cooperation across cultural boundaries, individuals sacrificing for strangers. The being was showing me that humanity's rapid development wasn't purely technological. Our social evolution, our ethical frameworks, our capacity for empathy was also developing, just at a slower rate. There was a race happening between our technological power and our wisdom, and the being couldn't predict which would win. That uncertainty was why the monitoring had intensified, why the being species was paying such close attention to Earth in this particular era. We were approaching a bifurcation point, a moment where humanity would either achieve a stable integration of power and wisdom, or collapse under the weight of capabilities we couldn't responsibly manage. I pulled back from the glass, my head pounding from the intensity of the contact. The being remained standing, watching me, and I realized I was seeing something like concern in its posture, in the slight tilt of its head. "You're worried about us," I said, not a question, but a statement. Not worried that we'll attack you or threaten your species. Worried about what we might do to ourselves. The being's hand moved in a gesture I'd learned to recognize as affirmation. I sat down heavily in my chair, processing the implications. Everything I'd reported to Colonel Webb, all the talk of threats and defense and countermeasures, had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding. The being species wasn't our enemy. They were observers, trying to decide if we were going to survive our own success. I spent the rest of that session in silence, just sitting with what I'd learned. When Dr. Patterson's voice came through the radio announcing the end of the session, I almost didn't respond. But I had responsibilities, reports to file, briefings to attend. I stood up slowly and looked at the being one more time. "Tomorrow, I want you to show me what happens if we cross the threshold. Not what your species will do to us, but what we'll do to ourselves if you don't intervene." The being's eyes held mine for a long moment. Then it made a gesture I'd never seen before. A slight lowering of its head, like a nod of respect or acknowledgement. It understood what I was asking, and from the weight of that gesture, I suspected the answer was going to be harder to bear than anything I'd seen so far. That night, I broke another protocol. I called Karen from a secured line. The first time I'd spoken to her since arriving in Nevada, 16 days earlier. "Robert, my God, where are you? Are you all right?" Her voice was strained with worry. I'm fine. I can't tell you where I am or what I'm doing, but I needed to hear your voice. We talked for 20 minutes about nothing important. Her work at the library, problems with the plumbing in our house, neighborhood gossip. Normal life, ordinary concerns, the world that existed outside this facility, and its impossible occupant. When we hung up, I felt both better and worse. Better because Karen reminded me of what mattered, of the life I had beyond this assignment. Worse because I couldn't shake the feeling that everything I'd learned in room 7 made that normal life seem fragile, temporary, balanced on the edge of a threshold we didn't even know we were approaching. The next morning, I reported to Colonel Webb before my session and made a request that I knew would be denied. Sir, I'd like permission to bring in outside experts, anthropologists, sociologists, ethicists. The subject isn't providing military intelligence. It's showing us how we're perceived by a species that's been observing us for thousands of years. We need people who can interpret that information from a civilizational perspective, not just a defense perspective. Webb's response was immediate and final. Denied. This facility is classified at the highest level. The subject's existence cannot be revealed to anyone without explicit authorization from Washington. You work with what you have, Agent Chandler. I tried a different approach. Then at least let me take a different angle in my interrogations. Stop pushing for technical details about their capabilities and start trying to understand what they think we need to change to avoid intervention. Webb considered this for a long moment. You're asking permission to let a potential hostile entity dictate human policy. I'm asking permission to understand what an advanced species that's been watching us for millennia thinks about our trajectory. That information has value regardless of whether we choose to act on it. Webb finally nodded. Proceed. But Agent Chandler, don't forget that everything this being tells you could be manipulation. It might be showing you what it wants you to believe, not what's actually true. Maintain skepticism. I agreed, though privately I thought skepticism was becoming harder to maintain. The being had been too consistent, too patient, too willing to communicate in ways that seemed designed to inform rather than deceive. Either it was the most sophisticated manipulator I'd ever encountered, or it was genuinely trying to help us understand something we desperately needed to know. When I entered room 7 that 17th morning, the being was already at the glass, both hands pressed against the barrier. I walked directly to it and placed my own hands in position without preamble. Show me what happens if we cross the threshold without your intervention. Show me the future we're heading toward if nothing changes. The contact was immediate and overwhelming, stronger than anything I'd experienced before. And what the being showed me justified every concern its species had about humanity's trajectory. I saw technological systems becoming increasingly complex, interconnected, autonomous. I saw artificial intelligence reaching levels of sophistication where human oversight became impossible. Not because we chose to remove ourselves, but because the systems evolved beyond our capacity to understand their decision-making processes. I saw genetic engineering pushed to extremes, human biology modified in ways that created cascading, unintended consequences. I saw nanotechnology deployed at planetary scales before anyone fully understood long-term environmental impacts. I saw quantum computing unlocking capabilities that some humans used for benefit and others weaponized, creating arms races in technology so powerful that a single mistake could have existential consequences. But worse than any individual technology was what I saw happen to human society under the weight of these accelerating changes. Social fragmentation, communities unable to adapt fast enough to technological disruption, massive populations displaced by automation and environmental collapse. Not apocalypse in the nuclear sense, but something more insidious. a gradual breaking down of the structures and systems that held civilization together, happening too fast for new structures to form in their place. The images showed me wars, not for territory or ideology, but for control of resources and technologies that could provide advantage in an increasingly chaotic world. I saw surveillance systems that knew more about individuals than they knew about themselves, used by governments and corporations in ways that eroded privacy and autonomy. I saw echo chambers and information bubbles become so extreme that different human populations literally couldn't communicate anymore, living in incompatible reality tunnels shaped by algorithms optimized for engagement rather than truth. And through it all, I saw the acceleration continuing, faster and faster, until the systems became so complex and interdependent that no one could predict what would happen next. The being showed me the endpoint of this trajectory, and it wasn't extinction. It was something stranger and more disturbing, humanity surviving, but transformed into something that could barely be called human anymore. Consciousness uploaded into digital systems. Biology merged with technology in ways that erased the boundaries between person and machine. Populations divided into those who could afford enhancement and those left behind. Not destruction, but fragmentation and transformation, so complete that the species that emerged would have almost nothing in common with the humans who had started down this path. And the being showed me the timescale, not centuries or millennia, decades. Based on current rates of acceleration, humanity would reach this critical point within my lifetime, possibly within the next 20 to 30 years. When the contact ended, I staggered backward and nearly fell. My nose was bleeding, a thin trickle that I wiped away with shaking hands. The being lowered its hands and stepped back from the glass, and I saw something in its posture that looked like exhaustion or sadness. It had shown me not a threat from outside, but the natural conclusion of the path humanity was already on. The intervention its species was preparing wasn't invasion or conquest. It was containment, limiting human technological capability to prevent us from destroying ourselves in ways we were currently too blind to recognize. I stood there in room 7, blood on my hand, head throbbing from the intensity of the contact, and understood with terrible clarity why the being had come here, why it had survived the crash while its companions died, why it was trying so desperately to communicate with the only human who had figured out how to listen. It was a warning, delivered by a species that had watched civilizations rise and fall, that had seen this pattern before and knew how it ended. And I was the only person in a position to carry that warning to the people who might be able to do something about it. Except I had no idea if anyone would listen, if anyone would believe me, or if the systems and structures already in place would allow for the kind of fundamental change that might alter our trajectory. The being had shown me the problem with perfect clarity, but the solution, if there even was one, remained frustratingly out of reach. I picked up the radio and called for Dr. Patterson, knowing that what I was about to report would either change everything or get me removed from this assignment as psychologically compromised. Either way, the comfortable certainties I'd lived with for my entire life were gone, replaced by knowledge I wasn't sure any human was meant to carry. I sat across from Colonel Webb and Dr. Patterson in the secure conference room, my hands still trembling from the morning's session. The medical team had checked me over, concerned about the nosebleed and what they called abnormal neural activity detected during the contact. I'd been cleared to continue, but with restrictions. Now I had to explain what the being had shown me. The subject showed me projected outcomes based on current human developmental trajectories. I began, keeping my voice steady. Not threats from its species, but consequences of our own technological acceleration. According to what I was shown, humanity is approaching critical destabilization within 20 to 30 years. I walked them through it systematically, describing the cascade of technological developments and social consequences. Colonel Webb's expression darkened. So this thing is telling us that unless we slow down our technological progress, we're going to destroy ourselves. And conveniently, its species is prepared to force that slowdown. You don't see how that's manipulation? I'd anticipated this. Sir, consider that it might be telling the truth. They've been monitoring Earth for an extended period. They would have observational data spanning human history. Or, Webb countered, they're threatened by human advancement and trying to convince us to handicap ourselves. Agent Chandler, you're being played. The debate continued for another hour with no resolution. Webb finally decided to bring in a psychological evaluation team to monitor my interactions. I was dismissed, frustrated, and exhausted. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the beings concerned, almost like a parent watching a child run toward danger. Why would an advanced species care what happened to us? The only answer that made sense was one I least wanted to believe. Despite our flaws, they saw something in humanity worth preserving. Day 18 began with my first session under observation by the psychological team. When I entered room 7, the being seemed to sense the difference. It remained seated, making no move to approach. I walked to the glass and spoke directly. There are people who think you're manipulating me. I need you to show me why your species cares what happens to us. The being stood and approached. When it placed its hands against the barrier, the image that came was unexpected. I saw Earth from the being's perspective during previous visits across human history. Ancient humans creating art on cave walls, and I felt the observer's fascination with these primitive creatures who had developed symbolic thought and artistic expression. Early agricultural settlements, first cities, first written records. Through all of it, I felt growing interest in this species that created meaning and beauty even in harsh conditions. The being showed me moments that had nothing to do with technology. A mother comforting a sick child in ancient Mesopotamia. Monks preserving knowledge through the Dark Ages. Scientists collaborating across political boundaries. Artists creating works that would speak to people centuries later. They'd been watching not just our technological development, but our cultural evolution. And they'd seen something rare. A species capable of both terrible destruction and profound compassion, always struggling between our better and worse natures. I understood what it was conveying. They'd developed something like genuine interest in our outcome. The warning wasn't about protecting themselves. It was about preventing us from cutting our own story short before we'd seen what we might become. The psychological evaluation team concluded on day 20 that I was experiencing what they called identification transference with the subject. Dr. Martinez recommended I be rotated out. Colonel Webb overruled her. He's getting more information than anyone else could. We continue. But he added restrictions. Sessions reduced to 4 hours. Daily, mandatory psychological debriefing after each contact, and a new directive to focus on specific tactical questions. The next morning, I returned to room 7 with a direct question. Your species has been watching us for thousands of years. You've seen us develop weapons, seen us fight wars, seen our capacity for violence. But that's not what scares you. Show me what actually makes humanity dangerous to you. The being's response was immediate and unsettling. I saw human history compressed, technological leaps appearing as bright flashes, but the being focused on specific moments. The development of agriculture, which allowed population growth beyond natural limits. The printing press, which accelerated information spread. The scientific method, which systematized discovery. Each innovation shortened the time to the next breakthrough. The being showed me graphs, though not in any human format, demonstrating how other species progressed linearly while humanity's curve bent upward. exponentially. Then I saw what frightened them. I saw humanity's pattern recognition, abilities, our capacity for abstract thinking, our tendency to share knowledge across communities. The being showed me how humans could take disparate pieces of information and synthesize new concepts that no individual had previously understood. We were natural innovators, almost recklessly so, capable of leaps that took other species generations of careful development. The being showed me specific examples. Einstein developing relativity by thought experiments. The Manhattan Project scientists achieving fusion in less than 3 years. Computer scientists accidentally creating the internet while trying to build communication networks. Human innovation often came from unexpected places, driven by individuals making intuitive leaps that bypassed normal experimental processes. To the being species, who apparently developed through careful, systematic progression, humanity's approach looked dangerously unstable. But there was something else. The being showed me human cooperation during crisis, the global response to the 1918 pandemic, international collaboration during World War II, the space race that, despite competition, advanced knowledge for everyone. When pressed, humanity could accomplish in years what should take decades. That potential, that capacity for rapid collective action when motivated, made us unpredictable. The being species couldn't model our behavior reliably because we kept exceeding or subverting their predictions. I saw their fear crystallize into a specific concern. Humanity might develop technology that could detect or disrupt their monitoring network before we'd matured enough to handle contact. Our rate of advancement in quantum physics, electromagnetic theory, and space-based sensors was approaching levels where we might accidentally discover evidence of their presence. And if we found them before we were ready, before we developed appropriate social and ethical frameworks, the revelation could destabilize human civilization in ways their species couldn't predict or control. "You're not afraid we'll attack you," I said, pulling back from the glass. "You're afraid we'll find you too soon, and the knowledge will break us before we're ready." The being made that gesture I'd learned meant affirmation. Their fear wasn't of human violence, but of human fragility combined with human curiosity. We were developing the tools to glimpse larger cosmic realities while still operating with tribal social structures and nation-state politics. That combination was potentially catastrophic. On day 22, Colonel Webb informed me that my assignment was being extended indefinitely. Washington wants everything this thing knows about their monitoring capabilities, their intervention methods, and their species' vulnerabilities. You've got 2 weeks to extract actionable intelligence. The shift in tone was clear. They weren't interested in warnings anymore. They wanted weapons. I tried to explain that the being's cooperation was based on perceived mutual interest, that treating it as an enemy source would destroy the communication we'd built. I thought Webb cut me off. "It's not cooperating, Agent Chandler. It's conditioning you. Every session, you come out more convinced that humanity needs to change, that we're the problem. That's textbook psychological manipulation. Now you're going to start pushing back." The next session felt wrong from the moment I entered room 7. The being was standing at the back of its space, as far from the glass as possible. It knew something had changed. I sat at my desk, holding the list of questions Webb had given me. Technical specifications for the monitoring network, locations of observation posts, communication methods between observers, defensive capabilities, response protocols, everything designed to turn the being's knowledge into military intelligence. I looked at the list, then at the being, then back at the list. I thought about Karen, about my career, about my duty to my country. Then I thought about what the being had shown me over 3 weeks of patient communication. a species trying desperately to warn us about dangers we couldn't see, using the only human who'd learned to listen. I made a decision that would define everything that followed. I walked to the glass without the list. They want me to interrogate you for military intelligence. They think you're an enemy, and they want to know how to fight your species. The being moved closer, its dark eyes fixed on mine. I'm not going to do that. Instead, I need you to show me one thing. If humanity doesn't change course, if we cross that threshold you've shown me, what exactly will your species do? Not capabilities or methods, just outcomes. What happens to us? The being placed both hands on the glass. The contact was gentle, almost careful, and what it showed me was worse than I'd imagined. Not invasion or destruction, but something more subtle and permanent. I saw Earth's electromagnetic environment altered in ways that made advanced technology impossible to maintain. Satellites deorbited safely, power grids reduced to local networks. The communication systems rolled back to early 20th century levels. Not an attack, but a carefully calibrated intervention that would freeze human technological capability at a specific point. The being showed me humanity adapting to this new reality. Populations relocating as modern infrastructure failed. Governments reorganizing around pre-digital administrative capacities. Knowledge preserved but unusable without the technological base to apply it. And most devastating, I saw the psychological impact. Billions of people knowing that their civilization had been deliberately limited by an outside force, that they were being managed like children too dangerous to be trusted with adult tools. The damage to human dignity, to our sense of agency and self-determination would be profound and lasting. But the being showed me something else. An alternative timeline where humanity chose differently, where we recognized the dangers of unchecked technological acceleration and implemented our own safeguards. International cooperation on AI development, ethical frameworks for genetic engineering, sustainable approaches to space expansion. The being species wouldn't need to intervene if we demonstrated capacity for self-regulation. The threshold wasn't a fixed line, but a test of civilizational maturity. When the contact ended, I stood there processing what amounted to an ultimatum. Change or be changed. Mature or be contained. The being had given me the clearest warning it could. Humanity's future was still ours to determine, but the window for that choice was closing. I submitted my report to Colonel Webb on July 1st, 1978. I documented everything the being had shown me, framing it not as intelligence gathering, but as a diplomatic communication from a species trying to prevent conflict through warning rather than action. I recommended immediate establishment of a civilian oversight committee, consultation with experts in ethics and long-term planning, and a fundamental reframing of how we approach the being's presence. Webb's response came within hours. I was removed from the assignment effective immediately. The psychological evaluation team had flagged me as compromised, and my recommendations were rejected as evidence of successful enemy conditioning. On July 2nd, I had one final session with the being, though I wasn't supposed to. I told the guards I'd forgotten personal items in room 7. They let me in for 5 minutes, alone. The being was waiting at the glass. I placed my hands against the barrier one last time. They're not going to listen. They think you're the enemy, and they're going to keep treating you like a threat instead of a warning. I'm sorry, I tried. The being showed me one final image. Myself, older, sitting in a house I didn't recognize, speaking to someone I couldn't see clearly. The meaning was clear. This wasn't over. Someday I would have another chance to tell this story. On July 5th, the being was transferred to another facility. Dr. Patterson told me it was somewhere in the Southwest, but he didn't know exactly where. My security clearance was revoked. I was reassigned to the FBI field office in Minneapolis, investigating white-collar crime. as far from Nevada as they could send me while keeping me in the bureau. I spent the next 27 years as an agent, working cases that felt increasingly meaningless compared to what I'd experienced in Room 7. I never heard what happened to the being. I never learned if its species took action, or if they're still watching, still waiting to see what we'll choose. I retired in 2005, moved to Duluth, and tried to live a normal life. Karen died in 2018, cancer. We never had children. Maybe that was for the best. I'm 71 years old, and I've spent 46 years carrying knowledge that the government buried, and most people wouldn't believe anyway. I've watched our technology accelerate exactly as the being warned. Artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, quantum computing, all developing faster than our wisdom about how to use them. I've watched social media fragment our reality, watched automation displace workers, watched climate change demonstrate our inability to coordinate global responses to existential threats. Every year, I wonder if we've crossed that threshold yet. If somewhere in space, the being species is preparing their intervention, ready to limit us for our own protection, or if we still have time to change course ourselves. I'm telling this story now because I saw something 3 weeks ago that terrified me. A news report about satellite anomalies, multiple communication satellites experiencing unexplained malfunctions. The pattern reminded me of what the being had shown me, that image of Earth satellites going dark simultaneously. It might be nothing. Solar activity, equipment failure, normal technical problems. But it might be a warning shot, a demonstration of capability, a reminder that they're still watching. The being told me something else in that final contact, something I haven't mentioned until now. It showed me that when the time came, if intervention became necessary, humanity wouldn't see ships in the sky or obvious displays of force. We'd simply wake up one day and find that our most advanced technologies no longer worked. Communication satellites offline, power grids destabilized, data centers corrupted. And we'd scramble to understand what happened, blaming solar flares or cyber attacks or equipment failure, never knowing that we'd been quietly contained by observers who'd been watching us since before we built our first cities. The being showed me we'd know we'd gone too far only by the silence, only when they stopped watching and started acting, only when our technology failed in ways we couldn't repair or explain. I don't know if that's what's happening now. I don't know if those satellite malfunctions mean anything or if I'm an old man seeing patterns where none exist. But I had to tell someone. I had to put this on record before I die, before this knowledge disappears with me. Maybe I'm wrong about all of it. Maybe I was manipulated, conditioned, deceived by a stranded alien, telling me whatever would ensure its survival. Maybe the psychological evaluation team was right, and I should never have been allowed near that being in the first place. But I remember those dark eyes looking at me through reinforced glass. I remember the patience, the careful communication, the sense of genuine concern. And I remember what it showed me about humanity's potential, both the beauty and the danger, the possibility and the threat we represent to ourselves. If this story reaches anyone who can make a difference, anyone in a position to influence how we approach our technological future, please consider what I've shared. Not as absolute truth, but as a perspective we can't afford to ignore. We're being watched. We're being evaluated. And the watchers are preparing for a decision they don't want to make, but will if they must. I hope we prove them wrong. I hope we find wisdom to match our cleverness, restraint to balance our ambition. I hope we grow up before they're forced to limit us. But every time I see news about breakthrough AI or quantum computers or genetic engineering, I think about that being in Room 7, and I wonder if we're already out of time. The satellites are still malfunctioning. 3 more went offline yesterday. I'm running out of time to tell this story, and and humanity might be running out of time to hear it.